What is going on, gunfighters? Welcome to Gunfighter Life, the podcast where we talk about guns and gunfighting the right way, with God at the center, Judeo-Christian values, and real-world, first-hand experience. I am blessed to be your host today. Instead of the normal bio, I'll give you a little bit of my surroundings. I am maybe having to back up pretty soon from the small fire on the bank of a river, a nice little beach spot where I could make a fire and not have to worry about catching anything else on fire. Alexander Hamilton, the Rhodesian Ridgeback, is next to me, soaking up some of the heat. Was having some technical difficulties today with software, so I would have to do the podcast on the phone anyway. So I figured, why not do an overnight backcountry fishing, foraging trip? So here I am, sitting by a fire, but I got an open jar of peanut butter next to me and some river water. I did have a smallmouth bass that I was keeping for dinner, but I decided to just let him go. Anyway, to set the mood for you guys of what's going on. And I plan on doing an after-action report, because if I'm out here in the backcountry and did a pretty long ruck/backcountry fishing trip, seems like it'd be a good thing to do an AAR, but that's not this episode. This episode, I was pondering today while rucking for quite a long time, the classic cartridges we have today, the ones that have stood the test of time. Why? Why are they classic? So maybe it's the campfire, maybe it's the ambiance. Whatever it is, I'm blessed to have the thoughts about this episode. So let's get philosophical here on Gunfighter Life. Why are the classics classic? And in doing this and taking some notes today as I was walking, I came up with some common denominators, which I think you will also come to realize. The first one I'm going to start out with is the 30-06. The 30-06 is a classic. There is no doubt. It is still, I don't know how to quantify this. It's probably still in the top 5, probably the top 3 of overall hunting cartridges in the U.S. And I do believe, just from what I've heard other places, I've been blessed to be around the world, but I've only ever hunted in America. I guess, unless you count people in warfare. But I'd call that something different. But as far as hunting here in America, the 30-06 is still one of the most popular calibers. And it came out, obviously, in 1906. 1903, if you count its pretty close predecessor. But well over 100 years. And it's still going strong. It's still taking elk and deer and bear. Why has it stood the test of time with so many new cartridges? Because that's the thing, right? Nobody knew at the time these were going to become classics. Just like this year, there will be who knows how many new cartridges that get introduced. And maybe none of them will become a classic. There's only a few. There's only a few classic cartridges. So why? Why do they become classic? Why does the 30-06 become classic? Well, one, it was adopted by the military. And you'll see that as a common denominator in a lot of the cartridges we're going to talk about today, that they were adopted by the military, and they did well. You know, the 30-40 Krag was adopted by the military, but it didn't do so well. The 30-06, did well. It served us well through 2 world wars. And a lot of those men came home and wanted a similar rifle for hunting. And you got to realize, when this came out in the early 1900s, what most people were hunting with at the time. They may have had, a 44-40 or a 30-30 or a 32 Winchester Special. And there's nothing wrong with those cartridges. But when this round came out, when the 30-06 came out with the Spitzer bullet and the bottleneck cartridge in, for the time, really high velocity, it was really a big step up. And there were other cartridges around the world that did this, but for us, for America, this was really the first taste of this. You know, Spitzer bullet, bottlenecked cartridge, round. And it did well. It did well in warfare. And I would have to imagine right after World War I, when those GIs were coming home and looking for a hunting rifle, they thought about that 30-06. Now, they probably didn't want a military straight-up version. That's when all the sporterizing, one of the times a lot of that sporterizing happened, because there were a lot of rifles available, obviously, after World War I. When that, what they call the Great War, was over, there was a lot of surplus firearms on the market. And a lot of them were or could be easily chambered in 30-06. And I think that really aided in making this a classic cartridge that has stood the test of time. A similar thing happened in World War II. Those men came home, and there were surplus rifles on the market. And a lot of those men, that's what they knew. That's what they had trusted. And even if other men didn't serve directly in the military, they probably looked up to the men that did, and the fact that those men loved the 30-06 probably lent itself pretty well to making it a classic cartridge. Aside from just the nostalgia and the military prestige of the round, it's a really, really good and versatile round. If you listened, you'll know that's what I chose for the Alaska rifle. It's a really, really versatile round, and I think that has helped it stood the test of time. You can go down to a 110 grain bullet. You can go up to a 220 grain bullet. And a lot of people go with the in-between, obviously. They go with the 150 to the 168 grain. It's probably the most popular. 180 grains are also very popular for a do-it-all, you know, deer, elk, bear kind of combo. The 180s are really a good choice. But a lot of people will do the 150s and the 165s. And really, there's nothing in North America that you can't take with a 30-06. Again, after much analysis, and there were newer, more whiz-bang cartridges, I decided for going to Alaska, the 30-06 was the best choice. Still, even though it's well over 100 years old. And that says something about the cartridge. And I didn't really care about the nostalgia. I didn't really care about that. I mean, I do like that stuff, but it was coming for me to put meat on the table and go to Alaska and have to deal with all that entails. I chose the 30-06 not for its history, but for its effectiveness. And it has both. It has both a great history and great effectiveness and great versatility. Again, I don't think there's anything in North America that the 30-06 cannot handle. And it came out over 100 years ago. And that says something. All right, now the next cartridge I'm going to talk about is based on the 30-06, and that's the 270. I think at this point we can call the 270 a classic. This is one of the ones that bucks the trend on the list. It is not a military cartridge, to the best of my knowledge, unless there was some weird thing. No military has ever used a 270. But it's a necked down 30-06 to .277 caliber. This makes a lot of sense because, again, there were a lot of rifles chambered in the 30-06, both after the First and Second World War, and a lot of the commercial cartridges. This kind of was the cartridge of the time, and it only made sense to, chamber other rifles in a similar size action, similar kind of rifles, but have a version of it. So it wasn't so hard to get new rifles in a different caliber. Had to feed that fire. Anyway, there's a lot of cartridges that are based off the 30-06. Not all of them are classics. I think the 270 is. Why is that? A couple of big reasons. One, Jack O'Connor. Jack O'Connor was a gun writer back when there was no internet, back when people got their information from gun magazines and publications. And he was a big fan of the 270. There's a lot of people out there that know a lot more of the history of the 270 than me. But I know he was a big reason, I believe, and many others, why the round became a classic. He took a lot of animals with it, and he wrote about it. And that made other people want to do the same. Also, it's a really good round. If you want something on the lower end of the 30-06, and I mean that, I'm trying to quantify how I mean that. I mean, you don't want it to handle as heavy of bullets. You know, the traditional grain of the 270 is 130 grain. You can get 140 grains, pretty common, but the classic is 130 grains. I'm getting distracted. There are some massive fish jumping in this river up here in northern Idaho. You might even be able to hear them on the audio. They're massive. Anyway, back to the 270. If you don't think you need something on the top end of bullet grain weight in the 30-06, the 270 offers a good performance in that 130, 140 grain range. It's a mild recoiling round. Not that the 30-06 is very punishing, but the 270 even less so. Also, back before the days of the laser rangefinder, you wanted a long point-blank range, meaning the animal that you were hunting, you wanted to be able to aim at the center of the kill zone of that animal and then hit it somewhere in the acceptable kill zone of that animal, your max point-blank range. And the 270 offers a very good max point-blank range. One of the best of its era, and it came out in the 1920s. And people back east use it too, but it's really a Western cartridge, I think, because that's where you can really take advantage of that max point-blank range in those wide open spaces. Not that there's none of that back east in bean fields and things, but the 270, when I think 270, I primarily think of a Western cartridge. And on the Western thing, the two main things you hunt out here are deer and elk. And the 270 is capable on both of those. If that's your primary meat source, deer and elk, the 270 will certainly take care of deer and elk. It has for a long time. And it does it without giving too much recoil, without having to move up to some giant inefficient magnum. And it gives you a pretty flat trajectory point-blank range. It's a good round for that. And I think that's why it's stuck around. It's a really good deer and elk round. It's not punishing. And you can pretty much make any gun that you can make in 30-06, that's a bolt action, in 270. Oh, and I should mention it also is kind of known, I think, and does well on sheep and goats, mountain goats, bighorn sheep, Dall sheep, things like that. And back before a laser rangefinder, again, a max point-blank range is kind of what you wanted on that. And the 270 is plenty enough power and bullet if you use the right bullet for those animals. All right, switching over. How about the 9mm? The 9mm is a classic. Why is it a classic? Well, it's a military round. And it wasn't our military round. And perhaps that's the reason why it took us so long to love the 9mm. It's now center stage. For a while, it wasn't. For a while, it was kind of looked down upon, I think, in the American gun culture. But recently, it has become the de facto defensive handgun caliber of our time. It was a military cartridge, obviously developed for the Luger. It came right around the turn of the century. I want to say 1908, but I'm doing this, on the side of a river. So that's not the exact year. Cut me some slack here. Go look it up for yourself. But in the early aughts, the 9mm came out. If you think about that, that's kind of amazing. Look at the defensive handguns available at the time. And I had the pleasure of shooting an old Luger. And it was impressive. I was making headshots, banging a little tiny head plate at 25 yards consistently with that old Luger. And it was reliable. Now, that Luger was awesome for the time. Really, really ahead of its time. But we're a long way from that now. If you look at the, combat handguns, defensive handguns that we have today, they're incredible compared to that. Why are we still using the 9mm? Well, I think because it's a really good balance. It's perhaps the best balance of firepower, effectiveness, and controllability. Because you can get too far off on that spectrum. And a lot of people, I think, want to go to that heavy side. Oh, if 9mm is good, then 357 SIG must be better. If 9mm is good, then 40. It's even hard for me to say that. People think 40 must be better. If 9mm is good, 10mm must be awesome. There's no free lunch. There's no free lunch in physics. For every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. And for every amount of power going out of that gun, you've got recoil coming back into the shooter. And for a practically sized defensive handgun, I think the 9mm strikes the best balance of power and effectiveness and controllability and shootability. And I have to imagine if it was an American caliber first, we would have embraced it a lot earlier. But the fact that even we've embraced it, there is no other cartridge, to my knowledge, that is so good and such a good balance of effectiveness and shootability that it's been adopted by pretty much every major military power, period, on both sides. What other caliber is there like that? Not the 5.56, not the 30-06, not 8mm Mauser, not 7.62x39, although adopted by a lot of cartridges. The 9mm is used by us, it's used by Russia, I believe it's used by China and Germany, the one who made it. Who doesn't at this point use 9mm? Because it's a really, really good effective cartridge. It gives you good capacity, it gives good controllability, and it is effective. And the advancements in bullet technology of the last 20 years has only made that far better than it was. But it's a really good, well-balanced cartridge. Another common denominator I think you will see throughout this Classics series. Now, going back to rifle. After World War II, we decided we weren't in love with the 30-06 anymore. We wanted to improve it. We liked the 30 caliber. We wanted to stick with 30 caliber, but we wanted to make it more efficient. Hence, the 308 was born. And the military, I believe, looked at their common loading. What stands out in my head is 150 at 2800, but it might have been like a 147 grain. It was right around 150 grain. And they looked at the 30-06, their military load, which is not a hot load. But that's the load they were using. They looked at it and said, can we make this more efficient? And the answer was yes. They came out with a 308, and I believe it did that for that thing. Now, I don't think the 308 is just the same as a 30-06, especially with heavier grain weight bullets. If you talk about the heavy grain bullets, the 30-06 does that better. And that's one of the reasons I went with it for the Alaska rifle. I wanted heavier grain bullets. But if you're talking about that 150 grain range, which is what a lot of people use, it's a more efficient round. It achieves similar velocities with less powder, with less case, with less length of the action. And hence, that's kind of where the short action thing came from as a standard. There were shorter cartridges, obviously, before that. But if you're talking about a standard short action, before that it was just the action. It was just the 8mm Mauser, 7 Mauser, 30-06 action. When the 308 came out, you could get a shorter action. So not only do you save weight in ammo, you save weight in the weapon itself. Whether the 308 is inherently more accurate or whether at the time it came out metallurgy and machining was just better, whatever the case is on that, the 308 is also known for being a very, very accurate cartridge. A lot of, up until recently, up until the birth of another cartridge we're going to talk about, it kind of was the go-to long-range cartridge. It was the go-to precision cartridge for a lot of things. It can be very, very accurate. And again, what the exact reasoning is for that, I don't know, but it's a very accurate cartridge. And here's the thing, except for really, really large game, the 308 is also really, really versatile for the things that most people hunt. Deer, and yes, elk. If a 308 is an okay elk round if you are really judicious about your bullet selection and bullet makeup, the things that, the bullet construction. So deer, elk, black bear, all the things that most people are going to hunt. The 308 is a good round. And since it's more efficient, uses less powder, less ejecta-mass, you get less recoil. So it has that going for it, and you can chamber it in shorter action rifles. So the rifle itself is a little bit lighter. And if you're talking about a rifle you're going to carry a lot, that's a big deal. The ability to carry that in your hands hunting for longer is a big deal, especially to me. That short action. People will say it's faster. I've never seen any empirical evidence on somebody running side by side a short action and a long action. It's a very small difference there, but it is lighter in the rifles. You can get lighter rifles because you don't have to make as long an action. So there is that benefit. It's a very efficient cartridge. It's a very capable cartridge. And again, adopted by the U.S. military. If my memory serves me correct, it was developed for the military, but Winchester put it out on the commercial market first, and then the military formally adopted it, I believe. But a good cartridge, the military adopted it. There were tons of good rifles chambered in it. The M14, the M1A, the FAL, the SCARs. There's so many good rifles chambered in 308. That's another reason, I think, that it has stayed in there as a classic. Not nearly as old as the 30-06 or the 9mm. This one came out in the 50s, but still, it's a little long in the tooth at this point. I think we can easily call it a classic. The next one that I'm going to talk about, the 38 Special. Now, this one is a little bit unique in that it is a military police cartridge, but unlike the others, unlike the 9mm, I think it's primarily a police cartridge when you think of 38 Special. 38 Special is a classic. It's so old, a little bit about the history if you don't know. It is not a 38 caliber. It's a .357 diameter bullet. The same diameter as 357 Magnum, 38 Special. It's called the 38 because at the time, this round is so old, they measured cartridges differently. And I guess they didn't want to confuse people by calling it a 35 caliber or a 36 caliber. They called it a 38 caliber. Because the other calibers at the time that were, around that haven't become a classic, they were just measured differently. That's how old this cartridge is. The 38 Special was on the hips of many a law enforcement officer, many a cop, many a sheriff, for many a decade here in America. It's been used in who knows how many different states and jurisdictions. And guys, I'm not that old. And when I was LAPD, there were still men there carrying wheel guns, carrying 38 specials. Still. We're talking, I joined LAP after I served 2 tours in GWAT, the Global War on Terror. We're not talking ancient history here. There were still men with 38 special wheel guns on their hip. And again, how many different municipalities, different towns, different cities, different counties did that serve America in? Not a military cartridge, primarily. Yeah, I know there was like the Smith & Wesson Victory models, and there were a few guns the military used in 38 special, but let's be honest, primarily it's a police cartridge. And it's kind of unique in that respect. Obviously, lots of police now use 9mm and around the world, but this one stands out as a uniquely police caliber. And obviously, with so many police using it, you know, there was a lot of surplus guns. There was a lot of citizens that wanted to defend themselves and their families, and they thought it was a good choice as well. And it is a good choice, and it's a capable round, especially considering the bullets at the time. You're talking, for a lot of that history, just lead slugs, just lead bullets. You know, hollow points weren't that common up until fairly recently. You're talking widespread adoption, I believe, in the 90s. There were some earlier, but really, the 90s and on is when you started seeing them become common. For a large chunk of that time, the 38 Special and other rounds were just lead rounds, a lot of times in the 38s, or just full metal jackets in the 9mm, but really, really rudimentary bullet technology, 158 grain, 148 grain lead bullets. And they did the job. Not the best ballistically, but certainly capable. And they've been, you know, defending people from bad guys for a long time. So don't think today that you're necessarily undergunned if you still use 38 Special. It's still a good round. The next one, kind of a cool history, an American round that wasn't embraced by America as much as it was other places. You know, what's more American when you think about guns than John Browning? Instrumental in so many things. One of the things we don't often associate him with is the 380. The 380 ACP. Before there was a 1911, there was a 1903 hammerless. Kind of a go-to defensive caliber of the day. Before, you know, all the new defense stuff today, there was the Colt Pocket Hammerless, a semi-auto defensive handgun. And again, the 380 wasn't necessarily adopted so much by us in our military, but it was adopted by other militaries. And I think at this point we can call it a classic. So if this one was never adopted by our militaries, but by foreign militaries, and not so much today, I don't think there's any major militaries today running 380. Why is it a classic? Why has it stuck around? And I think for a unique reason. We talked about that 9mm being really good and a really good balance between firepower and shootability. Well, that depends on the gun. If you have a full-size fighting handgun for a given cartridge, the amount of controllability there is one thing. If you scale down the size of that handgun, you're going to get more recoil in the shooter, because that recoil is going to go into one of two places, into the gun or into the shooter. The more mass there is in that gun to absorb that recoil, in general, there are design features and the way the gun fits you and things like that, but in general, you're going to get less recoil. And this, uniquely, is, I think, why the 380 has become a classic, because a lot of people want to carry smaller guns day to day. They're not professional gunfighters. They're somebody that, you know, wears a polo shirt and works in a cubicle and, you know, whatever the case might be. And they don't carry a full-size fighting handgun or even a mid-size fighting handgun like a Glock 19. They carry a much smaller gun. The 380 is more controllable in those smaller guns. I think you get to the point, and they've chambered a lot of 9mm super subcompact guns, but I think you get to a point, if most people are honest, where they get on the wrong side of that firepower versus controllability equation, and they'd be better off in a lot of those super small guns going down to a 380, and a lot of them do. And I think that's why we see the 380 still hanging on today and still going strong today. It's not as popular as 9mm, but it's still one of the most popular defensive handgun calibers. And I think that's because of those small guns. You know, if you're going to run a Glock 19 size gun, 380 doesn't make a lot of sense. But if you're going to run a Smith & Wesson Bodyguard or a Ruger LCP or a Keltec P380, something like that, it makes a lot of sense. It's the same bullet diameter as 9mm, but you're generally talking a lighter bullet, and you're talking lower pressures, less recoil. And it's still capable. It's a lot more capable today than it was decades ago, especially than it was in 1903, because bullet technology has come a long way, and I think it lets the 380 in particular punch above its weight class. And it's not the best, a super subcompact 380 is not the best defensive handgun, but it's a lot better than no defensive handgun. And for people that have to make that choice, they can't print, they can't carry a full-size fighting handgun, or they don't feel like they can, it's much better for them to be armed with something rather than nothing. And that 380 lets them do that. And I think for that reason, the 380 is a classic and continues to be a classic. By far, the newest one on the list that I'm going to call a classic, and it took a long time for me to warm up to this cartridge, and it's way newer on the list, and that says something, because most of these cartridges that come out every year, they just wither. Some of them die completely. Some of them just wither on the vine, and they just kind of hang out in the background. But they become a niche thing or a really specialty thing. Look at how many cartridges get introduced every year. Very few of them will become a classic. The ones we've talked about, the newest one prior to this was a 308. This one, if memory serves correct, came out in 2007. You probably know what I'm talking about. The 6.5 Creedmoor. Again, it took me a long time to warm up to this one. This one is also unique, and it was not. It may be now used a little bit, but it was not developed as a military cartridge. It was developed as a competition cartridge, and it's the only classic on the list developed as a competition cartridge. And that's fairly unique. What's also kind of crazy about this cartridge is it's not unique in its performance, really. It really doesn't do much for most people, that the 6.5x55 Swede doesn't do. And that's kind of a classic internationally, but not so much here in America. It was never very popular here in America. But the 6.5x55 Swede was doing this way back in the 1800s. Never became a classic here anyway. Also, the 260 Remington. Almost virtually identical. You get a 308 and you neck it down to 6.5mm, you get the 260. Why did that one? It was kind of a specialty cartridge. I always kind of liked it, but it was never a classic. It was never that popular. Why did the 6.5 Creed take over where those didn't? Well, I think a big reason why is it came out at the right time. It came out at a time when laser rangefinders were not only out, because they were out quite a bit before that, but they were out and they were affordable to the common person. Like the average blue-collar person could go out and buy a laser rangefinder. Remember, before this, I talked about point-blank range, and if you wanted to shoot or hunt long range, you wanted a long point-blank range, high-velocity rounds. When you could use a rangefinder and pretty much make anything that you were going to shoot at a known distance, then predictability and of the trajectory and the ability to cut wind became your prime directives. Because it doesn't matter if the bullet drops 36 inches or 42 inches, if you know exactly how much it drops and it's more predictable and it cuts the wind better, that's kind of what you want. Again, this was developed for long-range competition shooting. And it came out at a time where the average person could take advantage of that. I don't think that alone, though, would have made it a classic, because a lot of those competition shooters have since moved on to the 6mm Creedmoor and a bunch of other specialty cartridges that probably won't ever become a classic. Heck, even this cartridge's parent cartridge, the 30 Thompson Center, was kind of a flash in the pan. Why this one? Well, kind of like the 270 was to the 30-06, and this might anger some people that love the 270, but stick with me. Much like the 270 to the 30-06, so too is the 6.5 Creed to the 308. Because if you want to use that same action, those same rifles that are really, really popular in 308, pretty much any rifle you could chamber, at least bolt action rifle and many semi-autos, AR-10s are pretty popular, pretty much any of those rifles in 308, which is super popular, you could also chamber in 6.5 Creedmoor. And you'll get less recoil. And you benefit from one of the inherent good things about the 6.5, the high ballistics coefficient, the high sectional density. And much like the 270, what most common people that hunt are going to hunt, whitetail deer, mule deer, elk at reasonable ranges, black bear, things like that. The 6.5 will take care of that. The 6.5 will put those in the dirt. Again, it took me a long time to warm up to the 6.5 Creedmoor. And I actually was looking for a rifle, a particular rifle, super light, handy rifle. I like to do a lot of backcountry mountain hunting. And I wanted the Kimber Adirondack because it was, sub 5 pounds. And I still love that rifle. It's one of my go-to hunting rifles, probably my go-to hunting rifle. And I don't have it set up for long range. I don't hunt long range. In fact, I have it mounted with an LPVO. Exactly not, you might say the exact opposite of what that cartridge was designed for. Or if not the exact opposite, pretty far off of what that cartridge was designed for. But I like it because it's a short, handy rifle, short action. That's 6.5. It's very mild in recoil. I use that as a professional big game hunter and guide. I've killed many an animal with it. It's proven capable on sheep, on all kinds of deer-sized game. It's a very capable cartridge, especially the way I use it inside of 300 yards with proper bullet construction for the animal I'm trying to take. And if it will do all that with less recoil, very efficient, very capable cartridge, I think that coupled with its long-range capability has made it a classic. And that says something because it's by far the newest classic on the list. Okay, one more for you here. The 30-30 Winchester, right? The 30-30 Winchester, if it's not classic, I don't know what is. It's as classic as a 57 Chevy and apple pie. The 30-30 is a classic. Very American, although certainly used by law enforcement at different times. Primarily, I think, developed and marketed towards the rugged individual American, whether it was for defense, for a ranch, for a homestead, or for hunting. And I think that's pretty awesome. I think one of the big reasons that this is still popular today, because there were a lot of cartridges popular at the time that aren't popular today. 4440, 3220, 35 Remington. They're nowhere near as popular. The 30-30 is still really popular. Why is that? Well, I think a lot of that, again, has to do with the two there were many, many rifles chambered for this cartridge, but 2 primarily. And they're both really good. You know, they're right there neck and neck. I couldn't even pick which one is better. One of them may be better for a certain thing and the other for another thing, but the Winchester Model 94 and the Marlin 336, lever action, handy little carbines. And here in America, we love our lever actions, let's be honest. Maybe they're not the most practical, maybe they're not the highest rate of fire anymore, but you know, we just love them. They're just so American. We just love them. And they're good, handy little carbines. The Winchester 94 and the Marlin 336. And I would say almost certainly those two rifles, more than any other chambering, were chambered in 30-30. And yes, there are longer range cartridges today. You do give up some range. You could get a similarly weighted rifle in 308 and have better range, more aerodynamic bullet, higher velocities. But here's the thing. What if that doesn't apply to you? If you're looking for like a woods carbine, if nowhere that you hunt or defend or where you live, you can't see, you can't engage targets past 200 meters, then that's all kind of a moot point to you. And the 30-30 has been putting deer and elk and black bear down for hunters for over a century. And if those are the parameters that you hunt with or need for defense for a ranch rifle or a truck gun or whatever, it's a very capable cartridge. They're light, handy carbines. They're well proven both of those rifles, and there's other rifles chambered in them too, but those rifles are really well proven. They handle well. They're great hunting rifles. They're great saddle carbines. They're great truck guns. And they're lever actions. And who doesn't like a lever action? And there's no arguing with the 30-30's effectiveness on deer and many other animals, but especially deer. I mean, it's a deer slaying machine, that 30-30. So with that, I'm going to wrap up this episode. Guys, it's pretty late. The fire is going out. If I seemed a little tired, it's because I rucked quite a long way today. I got up, busted out a workout. Then when I saw the weather was going to be nice, and then I was having some software issues anyway, and I was going to be recording on the phone, I figured why not hoof it until pretty close to dark, and then sit down and record a podcast for you guys mobily. Hope you'll forgive a little bit of the rambling and the audio quality. I appreciate you listening to these classic cartridges still going strong and don't show any signs of going away anytime soon. Tactical tip of the day, and this is really a game changer. Like, I can start a fire a lot of different ways, but when I got here tonight, I'm primarily a backcountry fishing trip, so I fished up until and after dark. And I just wanted a fire. And cheap, easy, effective way. Cotton balls and Vaseline. I mean, it rained here the last couple of days. And I literally just walked along the bank of the river and picked up some driftwood. Broke up some kindling. Threw one single cotton ball with Vaseline in the middle of that. Now, granted, I know how to set up a fire. But one cotton ball with Vaseline, and I'm still sitting by that fire. Cotton balls and Vaseline. You know, that's a classic fire-making material and a game changer. Not that I can't make a fire, with a fire steel and whatever else, a magnifying glass or whatever. You can make fire a lot of different ways. But when you just want a fire going and the wood's a little damp, and they're so cheap and effective, cotton ball and Vaseline. If you don't have that in your bug out bag, in your kit, maybe even in your hunting kit, it's a good thing to have, cotton balls and Vaseline. I'm tired today. For the tactical verse, since it's so beautiful here, I'm just going to go ahead and recite. So it's too dark to see a page-turn Bible, I'm going to go ahead and recite Psalm 23. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside still waters. He restores my soul. He leads me in the paths of righteousness for his name's sake. And though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. You anoint my head with oil. My cup runs over. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. Amen. Thanks for listening, men. Have a blessed day.